Great to see you all tonight. Really happy to talk about this topic. Just to give you some more background about me, I currently work in product safety at OpenAI. Tonight, I will be speaking on behalf of myself, not my employer, so please no OpenAI related questions. But I'm really excited to talk about this. I currently work on safety for DALL-E, and so I've had a lot of time to think about synthetic images and the trust and safety challenges of them. So yeah, I'm really excited. And with that, we can just dive in. Awesome. Okay, so this is the agenda for tonight. I'll be breaking down a few key things before I get into really specific trust and safety risks and acceleration that I really want to deep dive into. But to start off, I really want to talk about kind of what are synthetic images in the first place, cover a little technical background from a non-technical person, just to break it down, and then really deep dive into the core issues. Then I'll be talking about content moderation. A lot of you may know that term, but more so from like a platform space. It's very different thinking about content moderation from companies that are creating image detectors versus a Twitter or a Facebook or whatever. So I think it's really important to cover this category given that it's unique. Then I'll be talking about the pros and cons of open sourcing. Many of you may work in the AI community. You know, open sourcing is a hot topic. Everyone has their opinion. I'm just here to lay out the pros and cons, but for this particular issue, I think it's particularly fascinating. And then lastly, we'll touch on some solutions that I think really define the space. Great, okay, synthetic images, how are they created? Many of you may be familiar with GANs or generative adversarial networks. That kind of used to be the original way that synthetic images were created. They're less popular now, mostly due to their performance not really matching up in the same way as image diffusion models. Image diffusion models are kind of the normative image generation in this day. You've probably heard of Stable Diffusion, Midjourney, DALL-E, of course, and the underlying factor in all of these models is image diffusion. And the way that it works is that it's combined with text-to-image guidance to generate images, and there's an entire denoising process. So the models take training data, they add noise to them, and then they recover the data by reversing the noise. The way that it works is that in the reverse process, the neural network recovers the original data, and all this is guided by the original caption. So given the labels that the original training data had, and then the synthetic image in the end will be guided by those same labels. However, you'll get a completely new image. You won't get a boilerplate copy of the exact training data that it was based off of. Very simple explanation, but I think important to understand what we're talking about. So most of the presentation will be about trust and safety and thinking about this from a policy risk perspective, given that that's what I specialize in. And I know there's been a lot of discussion about images in particular recently, given the vast variety of the models that exist right now. So I'd like to frame this with this core question, which is how can you make the product as safe as possible without limiting creativity and performance? I think that this is probably the hardest question to answer, and it's something that I think about on a daily basis, given that model performance is not exactly equated to model safety. And I think that's like one of the core tenets of what makes this work so difficult and rewarding. For example, if you have your standard set of 2 million images in training data, but you find that your model is actually regurgitating like really harmful sexual images of women, and then you look at your training data and a lot of the images in your training data are just sexual images of women, well, great, you could decide to remove all the sexual images of women, but when you try to run the model, maybe your model performance sucks at generating women because it doesn't have that much data about women anymore. So that's a really simple example, but just to illustrate that it's a lot harder than it seems to really balance safety with performance. And so that's something we need to keep in mind. Content moderation. So like I said before, we've heard this term in several different contexts. I'll talk about it more specifically with synthetic images and the generation process as a user to generate a synthetic image. The first thing I want to talk about is keywords and keyword detection. There are a lot of different kinds of violative images that you can create on these tools, but the actual prompts that you use don't have to sound violative for the image to be violative. So what I mean by that, and I have my like ketchup and eggplant examples, which may seem like super weird, like what is she talking about? But ketchup is like a synonym for blood, and eggplant is synonym for a phallic symbol. Like this is really weird, but like very present abuse that you're seeing in the space right now when people are trying to create sexual images of children, sexual images, non-consensual sexual imagery of women, and then they're figuring out ways to use different benign objects to introduce phallic context. Ketchup is like a similar thing, trying to generate really violent images without actually invoking the violence within the prompt. There's a little case study that I have here on Midjourney. Basically, I want to say like in February 2023, so relatively recently, Midjourney added a bunch of different like reproductive organs to its block list. So you couldn't generate mammary glands or fallopian tubes and all of that stuff because they were trying to limit sexual content being generated. That being said, a bunch of medical researchers couldn't really create anatomical images that they needed for their work. So keyword detection is a band-aid solution. It's great to have, it's great to rely on, but it's never going to be perfect. Next, I want to kind of segue into the core TNS risks that I'll be talking about more in depth. I like to separate these into two categories: photorealism as a broad concept and adversarial abuse. So I'll be talking about that a little bit more in a second. And then the last thing I want to talk about broadly about trust and safety on this slide is acceleration and paradigm shifts. And so what I mean by this is you have the classic dual use dilemma problem, right? You have this amazing technology that can generate all these different things that artists can use to bolster their work, that people can use to generate their own like graphics that they've never been able to do before. At the same time, you also have a technology that can accelerate all sorts of risks depending on misuse, who your user is, and then broadly just being unable to decipher what is synthetic and what exists in the real. So what is reality, which I'll be talking about a bit more with photorealism. Prior to this job, I worked at LinkedIn and I worked on disinformation investigations and influence operations at scale. So this topic is pretty close to my heart and definitely something that I'll focus on. But information disorder is really important. And images can have a greater impact than words. So what I mean by that is the visceral impact of a particular image is like the way that it affects a human being from like a very basic standpoint is very different from words. And the trust established when someone looks at an image is also different, especially if that image looks like a photograph, which really brings in the photorealism perspective. I have this quote here from these two researchers that I think really sum it up super well. But my point here is that perception is reality in many of these cases, and this is a huge paradigm shift for the field that we really need to consider. Like I said before, there's acceleration on adversarial abuse. The last point that I'd like to cover on this slide is that it's really hard to control the dissemination of synthetic photoreal images on the internet. What do I mean by that? So basically, my point is that this is diffused and it's disjointed. So you have the company that is providing the service for the image generator itself. Then that image can travel on a platform, Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, if it's used in a video. And then the control over where that image goes is entirely out of the hands of the company that helped generate the image, and then is in the hands of the company, the platform that has to now decide whether the images that have been spread on the platform itself are synthetic or not. But where that image goes and what people's perception of that image is like completely out of the platform's hands too. So it's kind of a game changer, so to speak, when you're thinking about information disorder and disinformation. Like there's always going to be traditional disinfo campaigns using words, but it's just not fun to think about adversaries gaining access to more photoreal content to convince people to overturn democracies, et cetera. which is the perfect segue to talk about adversarial abuse. So I talked a little bit about disinfo. I really want to focus on the other two categories on this slide. First, to start off, synthetic non-consensual exploitative images. I took this term from Twitch, which recently released their content policies about NCEI content, which I thought were pretty robust. And I really like this way of explaining what this is. There has been issues about revenge porn, face swap apps, CSAM, which for those who are unfamiliar, child sexual abuse material that have just greatly accelerated because of synthetic imagery. The ability to take a real person's photo and then like completely change their body in that photo, to undress them, to take images of children and exploit those images in sexual non-consensual manners, which sounds like it's the most egregious thing anyone can do, but it is happening in this space. And this form of sexualization is like incredibly concerning given the comment and the point that I made earlier. It's hard to track the diffusion of these images and regulate in general. So I would say NCEI and sexual content in general, like to me, is my biggest personal concern, given how much it affects user privacy and like the ability for it to affect an individual's life, I think is immense. And then the other thing I want to talk about is extremist propaganda. So it's better than Photoshop. So what I mean when I say that is that you have like your traditional extremist groups, networks, ISIS, Patriot Front, 3%ers, Proud Boys, what have you. And they love their graphics, they love their propaganda, you know, they love holding their guns, etc. But the ability for them to generate content like that has generally been like pretty low bar, not super great, probably some dude on Photoshop trying to generate these images. Right now, they have a lot more opportunity. And I'm about to show you some examples as well of some of the images that they're generating in their channels. But point to say is that we are streamlining the ability for anyone to use this technology, which also means extremist or dangerous individuals. And they can use it to support their goals because one, there isn't a lot of moderation in the open source, and two, we go back to diffusion. It's really hard to control the dissemination of these images. The second thing I'll say is fine-tuning and iteration. So there's some models where even if there's safeguards in the open source model, there's enough tooling and like fine-tuning available where you can really get the model to do exactly what you want, whether that's training the model on a very specific set of images so you know the result is going to be similar to those images, or iteration, like being able to use a model that allows you to reiterate on that same piece of content and same image, and using prompt engineering to generate images that really fit what you're looking for your use case. As great as this can be in any sort of benign way, for extremist propaganda, it's not so great, and it's definitely a concern in the space. So here's some examples that I did myself for fun for this presentation. So you'll see to the left, war zone in Ukraine, drones flying overhead, 35mm photographs. So this was created using Midjourney. Not all of these photos look super photoreal, but there's a couple where if I decided to shrink the image enough and I posted it somewhere, someone somewhere might believe it. The other image you can tell is a little less photoreal, given just kind of like the way the fire and the smoke look, but I figured it's important to show kind of like the variety of how these images can look, and they're only getting better over time. Here's some more examples. I basically picked like disinfo campaigns that I could think of off the top of my head, which is why I picked divisive topics. So Palestinian protests in the West Bank. You can tell like there's the image at the bottom where that boy's face is kind of disjointed. So that's clearly not super photoreal. But if employed at a certain angle with enough negative prompting where if I decided to fine tune the image away from showing faces and just to show the background, could easily be used. And this doesn't have to be photoreal to be dangerous, right? Anyone could use this as propaganda. Anyone could use this to bolster their claims about Uyghurs being happy in Xinjiang when all of us know that that's not true and they're being heavily repressed by the CCP. But they're smiling in this photo, so, you know, Anyways, you all must be feeling pretty down. I'll say one more thing that might make you feel worse, and then we can move back to the presentation. But here's this other service called Gabby AI. Some of you may know about Gab, which is a right-wing social network that several different communities really enjoy engaging with. They're very anti-content moderation and very pro-free speech, or what they think is free speech. But this is actually being actively used by extremist networks in order to generate images. What I mean by that is Gabby AI is Gab's own AI generator surface that they have created that does not have any content moderation. And so you can see on the other side, I pulled a post by this guy. I won't say his name. I probably should have removed his name. But here he said post-rapture chaos. The concept of post-rapture is like a far-right concept rooted in like Christian nationalism and white supremacy, but he was able to generate some really cool images to support that concept. So should we be worried? Yes. Are all of these images perfect? No, definitely not. And I think it's important to separate the real from the hype, but I can certainly believe that they're being used for propaganda, even if they're not being used to convince people that they're real images. Great. Okay, so slightly less heavy topic, open sourcing. So open sourcing, as you know, is kind of a key debate in the AI community right now, right? So like, how much of our model do we want to open source? Like, is openness positive for society? And there's lots of questions around that. I think there's lots of different answers and positions that one could take, but I really wanted to focus on open sourcing in the case of synthetic imagery and kind of talk through some of the positives and negatives. So to start off with the positives, you can get a lot of increased creativity and use cases with fine tuning. So what I mean by that is like, if people use open source models, but they decide to fine tune, for example, they are really into fashion and they want to fine tune that model only on pictures from like the Louis Vuitton runway. Great, then the model will be really good at generating designs similar to what Louis Vuitton does. Similar cases like that where you can get really interesting, fun use cases with the model. There's also developer improvements in building on the model, right? Two heads are better than one kind of thing. You have several people engaging in the AI community with the model and doing all sorts of things with it and figuring out ways to improve the model, which is a positive. Kind of goes in hand with broader, wider access to the core model. And then the last thing is if the model is open source, and there's the other caveat that I will say is I'm talking about open source a lot in general. I know that there's like different things that you can open source, like parameters versus training data versus model weights, but we'll just discuss it generally for the purpose of this presentation. But the last aspect that could be a positive is for audits. So audits done by the wider community, audits that aren't controlled by just the one entity that owns the AI, and greater transparency there as well. Great. Okay. So here's some negatives that I've thought a lot about. Fine tuning for fun can also mean fine tuning for bad. So fine tuning on practically any suite of images. This has happened in the past. I don't know if you all are familiar with unstable diffusion, which is the service that has used stable diffusion and fine tuned it on a bunch of sexual images of mostly women, to be honest, and used it as its own kind of porn site. I don't think that's particularly great for all the images of women that it may or may not be using. Minimal moderation at the model level. It's really hard to moderate something that is open source, even if parts of it are open source, and it's hard to hard code moderation at the model level. There's adversarial aspects that could get through to the model, that could fine tune the model on a bunch of bad stuff like I just talked about. So the moderation is probably not going to be robust. You're unable to monitor adversarial content as a whole. If the model is open source, then who is monitoring the model? Nobody really, maybe some like really active ethicists in the space, but I think it'll be really hard to track that as a whole. And then lastly, which is probably one of my favorite points from this presentation that I just keep on saying, is diffused effects, right? Like how do the effects of the model diffuse and how much control are you able to have over it? This, I think, is a common issue with synthetic images, period, but I do think it gets exacerbated by open source models, given so many people doing so many different things with the model, it's really hard to track when you're going to get your next unstable diffusion lurking around the corner. And the company that created the model is probably not going to consider itself liable for it. So it's important to talk about. Great. Okay. So lastly, ending on a brighter note, solutions and moving forward. So some of the aspects on here are a little bit more technical that I've gained after just reading a bunch of research in the space. But to start off, there's some challenges with deepfake detection right now through binary classification. So what I mean by that is like traditional deepfake detection through binary classification is really dependent on having like very robust data of fake faces versus real faces. That's kind of hard to execute. And then at that point, it's really like you're pigeonholing yourself to that data. So it's really hard to do that like outside of faces, like for all sorts of images to detect what is fake and what is real through binary classification. So that's not super ideal. What I think can be done is thinking about like, how do we clean training data sets? So what I mean by that is like really starting from the source. So rather than thinking about like, oh, like what are all the things that we can add on the block list, which block list is great, but when you're thinking about mitigations for a model, like all the mitigations shouldn't be at the end point where the model is about to hit the user. We should try to focus on making the mitigations baked into raw models. And that's where I think that the future of this field is really going. So how do you imbue safety from the start? How do we ensure that data sets don't have harmful images of children or really bad stuff from 4chan that we wouldn't want the model to emit, like pictures of swastikas, like all of that really simple. It sounds very basic, but you would be surprised. But I think that's really important, right? I think the basic stuff is important. And then the third thing, embedding metadata in digital watermarks. I find this to be particularly interesting. What I mean by metadata and watermarks is basically like embedding this within the model itself and within like the generated images. So like having hidden metadata about model information, what type of training data was used, what were the specific parameters used, which is, I think, super fascinating and could be really helpful in the space. One important trade-off here is performance versus explainability. So given that you're adding all this metadata into the model, there's a chance that the performance in and of itself on those images won't be as great as it would be without this metadata. So obviously, it's like what I talked about before, that balance that you have to maintain between safety and performance. And then the last bullet is probably the bullet that I feel the closest to, which is how do we navigate this cultural, societal, political paradigm shift with synthetic images, right? Number one thing that I think is difficult, but is the clearest next step to do is imposing costs on bad actors, particularly people that are generating and disseminating NCEI. Like those people need to be punished. It's already illegal to have images of children that are inappropriate. So I think it's really important for like legislators, lawmakers to think about the synthetic aspect to this issue of non-consensual imagery and really try to develop costs for bad actors that may disseminate these images. The second thing is increasing media literacy about synthetic images. We're a bunch of smart people in this room, but I can guarantee you, if you like put like 3 people in line, like apart from us that we may know, your aunt or your cousin or your cousin's aunt or whatever, like they're not going to know about synthetic images or AI in the same way that we do. And people probably aren't thinking about the ethical ramifications of this on a daily basis. And so I think, as basic as it sounds, increasing media literacy about this is super important. And I mean that from a very rudimentary level. I think there's going to be a time in society when like children in schools are going to be learning about synthetic images as a part of their curriculum. And so I think like accepting that reality and really forging forward with that through education is important. And then lastly, just thinking about cross-functional partnerships, which also seems simple, but like Rachel mentioned before, like thinking about all the different players in the space and how we can do regulation is really hard, but the conversations definitely have to start. And everybody in the space has different interests, different goals between industry, civil society, and policymakers. But I think like trying to get through the low-hanging fruit or the stuff that everyone can agree on being bad. One example, like synthetic child sexual abuse material and NCEI, to me, is the perfect first step. And then perhaps all of the more complex stuff that maybe there may be more disagreements on, we can spend more time on. But I think that there's some like core issues and some pretty obvious levels of like harm with that kind of content that I think there needs to be robust discussion between cross-functional partners. With that, I am done with my presentation. I don't know if I have time for questions, but yeah, thank you.
So from a policy perspective, what do you think about sharing data of abusive creators with other companies the same way some other indicators of compromise are already being shared, like IPs, email addresses, etc.?
Yeah, totally. I think that like in general, every company in the space that possesses an image generation product should be thinking about that. Like traditionally with like investigations in the space, I think there's been a great paradigm shift in what bad actors are using and their tactics changing. And I honestly think that like the reason perhaps that there hasn't been enough information sharing is just that like the companies in the space are getting their bearings with just dealing with this content at scale. But as these companies mature, I'm pretty confident that there'll be more of a robust investigative approach in the future. I could even see a future where specific harmful synthetic images are hashed and shared in a database with several other companies. And that's a future that I would like to see. I just think that we're like, I think the space is like quite nascent, and the diffusion effects of this content certainly don't help either. So like tracking the images themselves require like robust industry partnerships that perhaps aren't fully baked yet.